Dalton Keene thought he was buying an empty cabin. But when he pushed open that weathered door, a pair of startled green eyes stared back at him from across the room. In 30 seconds, everything he planned for his new life would shatter. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines as Dalton guided his wagon up the winding trail to what was supposed to be his fresh start. He'd purchased the remote cabin with his last savings, sight unseen, from a desperate seller in town who needed quick money. The deed sat folded in his vest pocket, legally making him the owner of this isolated piece of frontier land. After losing his ranch to creditors 3 months ago, this cabin represented his only chance to rebuild. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he approached the small wooden structure. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Dalton's heart sank. Someone was burning his firewood, living in his cabin, treating his property like their own. He'd spent every dollar he had left on this place, and now he'd have to fight for what was rightfully his. Climbing down from the wagon, Dalton straightened his shoulders and approached the front door. The wood was worn but solid, and through the single window, he could see movement inside. His jaw clenched. Whoever was squatting here would learn quickly that he wasn't a man to be taken advantage of. He'd worked too hard and lost too much to let someone steal what little he had left. Without knocking, Dalton pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was clean, well-maintained, with feminine touches that surprised him. Wildflowers sat in a jar on the wooden table, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. But what stopped him cold was the young woman standing by the fireplace, her long auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through the window. She turned slowly, and their eyes met. She was beautiful in a way that made men forget their own names, but her green eyes held a fierce defiance that warned him she wouldn't be easily intimidated. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite being caught in what was clearly not her home. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice steady despite the surprise that had flickered across her face. "I've been expecting you." Dalton removed his hat, unsure why he felt compelled to show respect to someone who was essentially a trespasser. "Ma'am, I'm Dalton Keene. I bought this cabin and I have the papers to prove it." She nodded slowly as if she'd heard those exact words before. "I'm Coral Lane, and before you ask me to leave," she paused, meeting his gaze directly. "You should know that I can't." The simple certainty in her voice sent a chill down Dalton's spine. This wasn't the response of someone who'd been caught stealing shelter. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested his problems were just beginning. But what Dalton didn't know yet was why a woman like Kay would choose to live alone in such a remote place, or what she was hiding that made leaving impossible. Dalton set his hat on the table, trying to keep his voice controlled despite the frustration building in his chest. "Miss Lane, I don't care what arrangement you had with the previous owner. I have legal papers, and this is my property now." Cora moved away from the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her. "I understand your position, Mr. Keene, but there are things about this place you don't know yet. Things that change everything. The only thing that matters is I paid for this cabin with money I couldn't afford to lose." Dalton pulled the deed from his vest pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Whatever sob story you're about to tell me, I've heard worse. I've lost more." Something flickered in Cora's eyes. Not fear, but what looked like pity. "I'm sure you have. But this isn't about money or legal papers. This is about survival." Dalton studied her face, searching for signs of deception. She didn't look like the drifters and con artists he'd encountered in town. Her clothes were clean, her hair properly braided, and the cabin showed signs of careful maintenance. Someone had been taking real care of this place, not just using it as temporary shelter. "Whose survival?" he asked, his voice softer now despite himself. Before Cora could answer, a sound outside made both of them freeze. Hoof beats approaching fast. Multiple riders by the sound of it. Cora's face went pale and she moved quickly to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. How many people knew you were coming here today? She whispered, her earlier calm completely gone. Nobody. I kept the purchase quiet. Dalton joined her at the window, and through the trees he could see 3 men on horseback moving up the trail. They rode with purpose, not like casual travelers. You know those men? Cora's hands trembled as she gripped the window frame. I was hoping they'd never find this place. The lead rider was a tall man with a black beard wearing a gun belt that had seen plenty of use. The other 2 flanked him like soldiers following orders. They weren't here for a social visit. Miss Lane, Dalton said quietly, what exactly are you running from? She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her defiance cracked. My husband, or rather the man who thinks he owns me. Dalton's stomach dropped. A married woman hiding from her husband changed everything about this situation. But the terror in her eyes told him this wasn't about a simple domestic dispute. He's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer, Cora continued, her voice barely audible. And he has resources most people don't. The hoofbeat tats were getting closer. Dalton found himself moving protectively between Ka and the door, though he couldn't explain why. 5 minutes ago, he'd been ready to throw her out himself. They're almost here, Cora whispered. But what neither of them realized was that the lead rider had been tracking Cora for weeks, and he had no intention of leaving empty-handed. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping from the hard ride. Dalton could hear the creak of leather as the men dismounted, their spurs jingling against the porch steps. Stay behind me, Dalton whispered to Cora, surprised by his own protective instinct. This morning, he'd wanted her gone, but now everything felt different. Sevens. A heavy knock rattled the door. Open up. We know you're in there. Cora. The voice belonged to the bearded man, and it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Cora's breathing quickened, and Dalton could feel her fear like a living thing in the small cabin. What do you want me to tell them? Dalton asked quietly. Nothing. Cora whispered. Don't let them know you've seen me. But it was too late. The door handle turned, and the 3 men stepped inside without invitation. The leader's eyes swept the cabin and immediately found Cora standing behind Dalton. A cold smile spread across his weathered face. There you are, darling. You've led us quite a chase. Dalton stepped forward, blocking the man's path to Cora. This is private property. You're trespassing. The bearded man's attention shifted to Dalton, sizing him up like a predator evaluating threat. I'm Marcus Webb. That woman behind you is my wife, and she's coming home with me. I'm not your wife, Cora said, finding her voice. That ceremony was forced. And you know it. Marcus's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. The law says otherwise, and the law is what matters out here. Dalton felt the weight of his gun against his hip, but 3 against 1 wasn't good odds, especially when he didn't fully understand what he was fighting for. The lady says she doesn't want to go with you. The lady, Marcus emphasized the word mockingly, doesn't have a choice. She belongs to me, same as livestock or property. The casual cruelty in those words made Dalton's jaw clench. He'd known men like Marcus before. Men who believed power gave them the right to own people. Nobody belongs to anybody else. One of Marcus's companions, a thin man with cold eyes, moved to flank Dalton. Boss, we could just take her. This cowboy's outnumbered. But Marcus held up a hand. Still studying Dalton. You seem like a reasonable man. Walk away from this and nobody gets hurt. This is a family matter, not your concern. Dalton could feel Ka trembling behind him, but she hadn't run or begged. Whatever had happened between her and Marcus, she was determined to face it standing up. I bought this cabin legally, Dalton said. Miss Lane is my guest. That makes this my concern. Marcus's expression darkened. Your guest? How long have you known my wife exactly? The question was loaded with implications that made Dalton's blood run cold. Marcus wasn't just tracking down a runaway wife. He was hunting for reasons to justify whatever he planned to do to her. Long enough to know she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go, Dalton replied. Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already decided. I was hoping we could handle this civilized, but it seems you've chosen to interfere in matters that don't concern you. Sevens. The thin man's hand moved closer to his gun, but Marcus had already made a decision that would change everything for all of them. Marcus stepped back and gestured to his men. Burn it down. The words hit Dalton like a physical blow. What? You heard me. Marcus's voice was casual, as if he just ordered coffee. If my wife prefers this cabin to her proper home, then maybe she needs to see what happens to places that harbor runaway wives. The thin man immediately moved toward the fireplace, grabbing a burning log. Cora gasped behind Dalton, and he felt something snap inside his chest. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about basic human decency. You burn this cabin, you're destroying my livelihood, Dalton said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. I put everything I had into this place. Marcus shrugged. Should have minded your own business. The third man, silent until now, drew his weapon and pointed directly at Dalton's chest. Boss wants you to step aside. I suggest you listen. Dalton's mind raced. 3 armed men, one of him, and a woman to protect. But something in Cora's earlier words echoed in his memory. This wasn't just about a bad marriage. This was about survival. Mr. Keene, Cora said quietly. Let me go with them. Don't lose everything because of me. But when Dalton glanced back at her, he saw something that changed his mind completely. Cora's hands were pressed protectively against her stomach, and suddenly her loose-fitting dress made perfect sense. She wasn't just running for Marcus. She was protecting something far more precious. No, Dalton said firmly, turning back to face Marcus. She stays. Marcus noticed Dalton's gaze and followed it to Cora. When understanding dawned on his face, his expression turned murderous. You think that baby is yours, stranger? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Dalton realized Marcus was painting a picture that would justify anything he wanted to do to both of them. The child isn't his, Cora said, her voice stronger now. And it isn't yours either, Marcus. You know that. Marcus's face went red with rage. Everything about you belongs to me, including whatever's growing inside you. The casual evil in those words made Dalton's decision for him. He'd lost his ranch, his savings, and most of his hope over the past few months. But he wouldn't lose his humanity by standing aside while a pregnant woman was dragged away by a monster. Dalton's hand closed around his gun grip. She said, She's not going. That's the end of it. The thin man with the burning log laughed. 3 guns against 1? You sure about this, cowboy? Marcus held up his hand again, studying Dalton with new interest. Actually, I have a better idea. Since you're so eager to play hero, let's make this interesting. But what Marcus proposed next would test everything Dalton thought he knew about courage. Sevens. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Here's what's going to happen, cowboy. You and me, we're going to settle this like men. 1 gun, fair fight. You win. I ride away and never bother Cora again. Dalton felt his heart hammering against his ribs. A fair fight with Marcus Webb was likely a death sentence, but it was better odds than facing 3 men at once. And if you win, Dalton asked. When I win, Marcus corrected. Cora comes home with me and you get buried in that nice soft dirt outside your cabin. Cora stepped forward, her face pale but determined. No, I won't let you die for me, Mr. Keene. You don't even know me. But Dalton was thinking about the protective way she'd held her stomach, the terror in her eyes when Marcus appeared, and the quiet dignity with which she'd faced an impossible situation. Maybe he didn't know her whole story, but he knew enough. "I know you're carrying a child that doesn't deserve to grow up with a father like him," Dalton said, not taking his eyes off Marcus. Marcus's jaw tightened. "That child will learn discipline and respect, same as its mother should have." The way Marcus spoke about the unborn baby, like property to be controlled rather than a life to be cherished, made Dalton's blood run cold. He'd seen what men like Marcus did to children who couldn't defend themselves. "You're afraid to face me alone," Dalton said, deliberately provoking Marcus. "That's why you travel with hired guns." Marcus's face darkened, and he gestured for his men to step back. "Clear the porch. This won't take long." As the two men moved outside, Cora grabbed Dalton's arm. "He's faster than he looks, and he's killed before. I've seen him do it." Dalton covered her hand with his, surprised by how right the gesture felt. "What's the real story? Ka? Why did you marry him?" Her eyes filled with tears. She refused to let fall. "My father owed Marcus money he couldn't pay. Marcus offered to forgive the debt in exchange for me. My father was dying, and I couldn't let him lose everything because of medical bills." The pieces clicked into place. Ka hadn't just been sold into marriage. She'd sacrificed herself to save her family. And now she was protecting her unborn child the only way she knew how. "The baby's father?" Dalton asked gently. "A good man who died before he knew about the child. Marcus found out I was pregnant and decided it would be his heir. Whether the child wanted him as a father or not." Dalton nodded, understanding everything now. This wasn't about property or pride. This was about a woman trying to protect her child from a monster who saw people as possessions. Marcus's voice carried from outside. "Time's up, cowboy. Let's see what kind of man you really are." But as Dalton walked toward the door, Cora whispered something that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. Cora's whisper stopped Dalton cold. "Marcus isn't just my husband. He's the one who killed your brother." Dalton's blood turned to ice. His brother Samuel had been found shot dead on a remote trail 6 months ago. His horse and supplies stolen. The sheriff claimed it was random bandits, but the case had gone cold with no witnesses or leads. "Samuel Keene was your brother." Cora's voice was barely audible. "I overheard Marcus bragging to his men about killing a rancher who wouldn't sell his water rights. He described the man's face, his horse, even the scar on his hand from a childhood accident." Dalton's vision blurred with rage. Samuel's death had been the final blow that forced him to sell everything and buy this remote cabin. Marcus hadn't just destroyed Cora's life. He'd destroyed Dalton's family. "You're certain?" Dalton's voice came out as a growl. "He kept your brother's watch, the one with initials carved inside. He showed it to me when he wanted to demonstrate what happened to men who opposed him." Dalton stepped outside, his hands steady on his gun despite the fury coursing through his veins. Marcus stood 20 paces away, confident and relaxed while his two men watched from the porch with eager anticipation. "Before we do this," Dalton called out, "tell me about Samuel Keene." Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Never heard of him. Rancher who wouldn't sell his water rights. Shot on the North Trail 6 months ago." Now Marcus smiled genuinely, the mask of civility finally dropping completely. "Oh, that's Samuel Keene. Stubborn fool thought his principles were worth more than his life." The admission hit Dalton like a physical blow, but it also gave him something he'd been missing for months. Certainty. This wasn't just about protecting Cora anymore. This was about justice for Samuel. "He was my brother." Marcus's smile widened. "Then this is even better than I thought. I get to finish what I started." The two men faced each other across the dusty clearing, hands hovering over their weapons. Dalton could hear his own heartbeat, but underneath it was something else. Samuel's voice from their childhood, teaching him to shoot straight and stand up for what was right. "On 3, Marcus called out. 1, Dalton's mind cleared. focusing on the man who had murdered his brother and terrorized an innocent woman. 2. Time seemed to slow as both men's hands moved toward their guns. 3. The clearing exploded with gunfire. Marcus was fast, faster than most men Dalton had ever faced. But grief and righteous anger had sharpened Dalton's reflexes to a razor's edge. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Webb lay motionless in the dirt, his gun still half drawn. But as Dalton stood over his brother's killer, Marcus's 2 remaining men stepped off the porch with their weapons already drawn. The thin man's gun was already aimed at Dalton's chest before he could react. "Boss might be dead, but you still killed him. That makes you a wanted man." Dalton's gun was empty, and reloading would take precious seconds he didn't have. The 2 men advanced slowly, savoring their advantage. "Should have minded your own business, cowboy," the 3rd man said. "Now you're going to pay for interfering." But before either man could pull their triggers, a rifle shot cracked from the cabin window. The thin man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Cora stood framed in the doorway, holding an old hunting rifle with practiced ease. "The next shot won't be a warning," she said calmly. The remaining gunmen whirled toward her, but Dalton used the distraction to dive behind Marcus's body and reload his weapon. When he came up firing, the last of Marcus's men was already running for his horse. Dalton let him go. One witness to tell the story might actually work in their favor. Cora lowered the rifle and walked over to where Marcus lay still. She looked down at the man who had controlled her life for months, and Dalton expected to see relief or satisfaction. Instead, her face showed only exhaustion. "It's over," she said quietly. But Dalton was studying Marcus's body, and something didn't add up. You said Marcus kept my brother's watch." She nodded. "He always wore it on a chain like a trophy." Dalton knelt and searched Marcus's vest, finding the familiar silver watch that had belonged to their father before passing to Samuel. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories. Christmas mornings, cattle drives, the proud day Samuel had inherited it. But as Dalton opened the watch case, he found something unexpected. Inside, along with the initials SK their father had carved, was a folded piece of paper. "What is it?" Cora asked. Dalton unfolded the paper carefully. It was a map drawn in Samuel's handwriting, marking the location of something in the mountains north of here. At the bottom, Samuel had written, "For my brother Dalton if anything happens to me." Samuel knew Marcus was going to kill him. Dalton realized. He hid this message knowing I'd eventually get the watch back. Kay moved closer to study the map. "What do you think he wanted you to find?" Before Dalton could answer, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. More riders were coming up the trail, moving fast. The man who escaped, Cora said he must have gone for help. But as the riders emerged from the trees, Dalton saw something that changed everything. The lead rider wore a sheriff's badge, and behind him rode 6 armed deputies. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Cora whispered. "No, he's been looking for me ever since I disappeared. Marcus told him I was stolen by bandits." Dalton looked at the dead body of Marcus Webb, then at the pregnant woman beside him holding a smoking rifle. In about 30 seconds, he was going to have to explain to a sheriff why he'd killed a supposedly respectable man and why he was harboring a kidnapped woman. But the map in his hand suggested Samuel had left him more than just a clue about his death. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face taking in the scene. Marcus's body, the wounded gunman crawling toward his horse, and Cora standing beside Dalton with the rifle. "Miss Cora," the sheriff said carefully. "Marcus Webb reported you were kidnapped, said he was organizing a search party." Cora stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Sheriff Morrison, Marcus Webb forced me into marriage to pay my father's medical debts. When I discovered I was carrying another man's child, he became violent. I ran to protect my baby." The sheriff's eyes moved to Marcus's body. "And this man, Marcus Webb, murdered my brother Samuel 6 months ago," Dalton said, pulling out the watch. He kept this as a trophy. Miss Lane overheard him bragging about it. Sheriff Morrison examined the watch, recognizing the initials and the distinctive scratches Samuel had always complained about. "I remember this watch." Samuel never went anywhere without it. "Marcus also tried to burn down my legally purchased cabin and threatened to kill Miss Lane and her unborn child." Dalton continued. "I challenged him to a fair fight, and he accepted." The wounded gunman, now mounted on his horse, called out desperately, "Sheriff, they murdered Mr. Sevens." Webb in cold blood. He was trying to rescue his wife. But Cora had moved to her bag inside the cabin and returned with a bundle of papers. "These are the marriage documents Marcus forced my dying father to sign. You'll see the debt amounts and the threats written in Marcus's own hand." Sheriff Morrison studied the papers, his expression growing darker. "These aren't legal marriage documents. These are extortion papers." The wounded gunman realized his story was falling apart and spurred his horse toward the tree-line, but 2 deputies were already moving to intercept him. "The real question," Sheriff Morrison said, "is what happens now?" Dalton unfolded Samuel's map and showed it to the sheriff. "My brother left me this before he died. It marks the location of evidence he gathered about Marcus's illegal activities: stolen water rights, murdered ranchers, extorted families." Samuel was investigating Marcus, the sheriff asked. Apparently, for months, he knew Marcus would kill him eventually, so he documented everything and hid it where only I would think to look. 3 days later, following Samuel's map, they recovered a detailed record of Marcus Webb's crimes hidden in a cave north of the cabin. The evidence implicated several corrupt officials and led to the recovery of stolen property worth thousands of dollars. Cora's marriage to Marcus was declared invalid by the territorial court. The same court awarded her damages from Marcus's seized estate, enough money to ensure her child would never want for anything. 6 months later, Dalton stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching Cora hang laundry in the morning sun. Her pregnancy was showing clearly now, and she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. She looked up and caught him watching. "Hey, come." The baby kicked for the first time this morning. Dalton smiled, still amazed by how completely his life had changed. He'd bought this cabin expecting to live alone, nursing his grief and rebuilding from nothing. Instead, he'd found justice for Samuel, saved an innocent woman, and discovered that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as problems. "Have you decided on a name?" he asked. Cora's hand rested on her stomach. "Samuel, if it's a boy, for the man who made all of this possible." Dalton nodded, thinking his brother would have approved of that. Samuel had always believed that good people found each other when they needed it most. Looking at Cora now, safe, free, and preparing to bring new life into the world, Dalton knew his brother had been right about more than just Marcus Webb's crimes. Some purchases, he reflected, turn out to be worth far more than you ever imagined.